Welcome back to the Healthy Middle Ground podcast with me, Jen Curtis. Now, normally I talk about fat loss, about lifting weights, but this episode is the first episode in a series I'm going to be doing on pregnancy. So I don't know, it's going to be called the pregnancy podcast. Let's keep things simple. And basically my plan is for the rest of my pregnancy to create a podcast that talks about the things that I wanted to know in my pregnancy. There doesn't seem to be much good information out there when it comes to pregnancy. There's podcasts for everything, but there doesn't seem to be one that offers good training, nutrition, and weight management advice. So that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about in this series. I'm going to be talking about managing your weight during pregnancy, which I think is a super important topic, making sure that you're not gaining too much weight, training, everything that has to do with training during pregnancy, maintaining muscle mass, body image, all of that kind of stuff. And I want to come at it from a slightly different angle, not just, look, anyone can go and Google the guidelines and find out how much weight can you gain during pregnancy, how much weight should you lift during pregnancy, but nobody's really discussing the ins and outs and the nuance of it. So that's what I want to do on this podcast, talk about maybe some of the more controversial things that other people aren't covering and just give you some really honest, practical advice for maintaining a healthy weight, continuing to maintain muscle mass, stay strong, stay fit during pregnancy, and set yourself up for postpartum. And with my particular spin on things, which is, I do care a lot about maintaining fitness, maintaining mobility, maintaining strength throughout this period of our lives of having babies and being postpartum. But also I care about getting lean and looking good and, having definition and stuff like that. So we're coming at it from that maybe slightly more ambitious angle as well. Okay, so now I've introduced this pregnancy series. Let's dive into today's episode. We're going to be talking about the question, can you gain muscle during pregnancy? And this episode is part one. I'm going to split this into two parts. Part one is going to be for women who are already lifting weights, right? Before pregnancy, they're experienced lifting heavy weights and they want to continue lifting weight during their pregnancy. And they're wondering if you can continue to gain muscle mass during your pregnancy. Part two is going to be for women who have never lifted weights before or who have had a very long break since the last time they were lifting weights. I'm splitting this up into these two different categories because it's very different for these two different groups of people. Short answer is that if you're already very strong and you're already lifting heavy weights, it's actually going to be harder for you to continue building muscle during pregnancy for a whole bunch of reasons that I'm going to talk about in this podcast episode. Whereas if you're a complete beginner and you're just starting out, this might sound counterintuitive, but it's actually easier for you to build muscle and it's more likely that you'll be able to build muscle during your pregnancy. Okay, so if you've never lifted weights before, if you want to start during pregnancy or if you've had a very long break, check out part two of this podcast episode. That will be more relevant to you. Okay, so for those of you who are listening who are already lifting weights, you want to continue lifting weights during pregnancy and you want to know if you can continue building muscle, let's answer that question. As I said before, in theory, yes, you can. But in practice, there are lots of things that are going to get in your way. And the more muscle mass you have going into your pregnancy, ironically, the more difficult it's going to be to continue gaining muscle during pregnancy. And that's also just simply because even outside, independent of pregnancy, it's harder, the more muscle mass you have, the harder it is to continue building muscle mass because you are subject to the law of diminishing returns. But when it comes to pregnancy, on top of that, you've got to deal with a lot of really icky symptoms that make training hard much more difficult. So in this podcast episode, what we're going to talk about is, number one, what actually causes muscle building, right? Because understanding that is at the center of this. Understanding what conditions you need to actually be building muscle is really important. And the same rules apply to pregnant and non-pregnant women. We're going to talk about pregnancy symptoms that make it hard to reach these conditions that create muscle gain and muscle growth. And then we're going to talk about the practical things that you can do, as well as the mindset shifts that you need to approach building or perhaps just maintaining muscle mass during pregnancy. Okay, so let's start with what actually causes hypertrophy, which is muscle growth. There are basically 3 conditions that you need to meet in order to build muscle. And this applies for men, it applies for women, it applies for pregnant women, postpartum women, women who have never had a baby before, it applies for menopausal women. This is just what applies to humans. And those 3 conditions are, number 1, mechanical load or tension. So that means lifting weights that actually challenge the muscles. Okay, so if you're just lifting 2 kilos, you're not actually going to build any muscle. Number 2 is progressive overload. So you actually have to increase the weights over time, or the training intensity or volume. This is where it gets a little bit complicated because there's a few things that contribute to this, but you basically need to increase the weights over time in order to be building muscle, especially in the beginning phases. And if you're not increasing the weights, you need to be increasing training volume over time, which is increasing the reps or sets of any particular muscle group. The 3rd condition you need to meet is proper nutrition and recovery. So supplying adequate protein and calories for muscle protein synthesis to occur. And you also need enough rest and sleep for muscle growth to actually occur. Okay, so let's dive into each of those. So mechanical load is basically saying that you need to actually load the muscles with weight to build muscle. This is the main driver of muscle growth. And this is the main thing that a lot of women overlook. They're lifting way too little weight. So they might be lifting like a 4 kilo dumbbell or a 10 kilo dumbbell, and they're just lifting the same weights over and over and over again. The word heavy is a relative term. It's relative to your strength levels. So if you're really, really weak and you're just starting out, 4 kilos or 10 pounds might absolutely be enough for you to start building muscle. It might be enough for you in those initial sessions to build muscle. But for most of us, it's way below our actual strength level. And beyond, once we sort of like done it for a while, we start to plateau, but we'll get onto that in a moment. So you have to be loading the muscles sufficiently in order for muscle growth to occur. And pregnancy gets in the way of that in a number of different ways. So for most of us, when we go into our first trimester, we find that we're very, very, very weak. So I'll take myself as an example. This is my 4th pregnancy. I'm week 12 now. I suffer from really, really, really severe fatigue in my first trimester. And my subjective sense of like how strong I am is massively impacted by the fatigue. It's very hard to tease apart like what's actual loss of strength and what I actually feel like I'm capable of lifting way less weight. But is that because of fatigue, or is it because of low motivation, low mood? Or is it because, I've actually lost strength, or because of changes to connective tissue, etc.? It's very hard to tease out what it is, but in a practical sense, the extreme fatigue and the nausea makes it incredibly difficult to lift weights, the weights that you were lifting before. This has been my experience through 4 pregnancies. And in my previous pregnancies, my first 3 pregnancies, I don't think I lifted more than 5 kilos in my first trimester. Not because it was dangerous, not just because I was so fatigued. I just couldn't bear the thought of doing anything. I went from being somebody lifting really quite heavy weights, doing 10 pull-ups, squatting my body weight, this kind of thing, and really enjoying my strength sessions, to then just dreading them. And my attitude through my first 3 pregnancies is it's better to do something rather than nothing. I'll just do this with a 4 or 5 kilo weight. I'll just move around a little bit. I'm not going to worry too much about muscle building or maintaining my muscle mass. I'm just going to move. My fourth pregnancy, I had a lot more experience behind me. And what I decided to do was to reduce my program so that I was, every strength session, I was only doing sort of 3 compound exercises like legs, push and pull. So rather than doing sort of 10 different exercises or even 6 exercises, I was just doing 3 exercises, 2 or 3 sets, and just try to go as heavy as I could and push through those sets. And I was able, this fourth pregnancy, to lift much more weight than I was lifting in my first trimesters. But still, my overall training volume still went down because I went down to doing just 1 exercise per muscle group. But I was lifting more, I have been lifting more weight, which helps. It's the main driver for building muscle. So doing 1 exercise, say like doing a squat with a heavier weight for 2 or 3 sets, is going to drive muscle growth or maintaining muscle mass more than doing 3 different exercises for your legs and all of them being with like 5 kilos or 10 pounds. So the first thing that gets in the way of being able to do that, of being able to lift heavy weights, is the fatigue, right? And that is really debilitating for a lot of women, especially in the first trimester. But if you manage to get through your first trimester without that debilitating fatigue, good for you, right? You're going to be able to lift more weight. You're going to be able to do more sets per muscle group, more overall training load, more overall training volume. And that's going to help you preserve muscle or even build it. But if you're not able to do the training intensity, the same amount of weight per muscle group or per exercise, and if you're not able to do the same amount of training volume, so the same number of sets per muscle group, it's going to be very, very, very difficult to build muscle. It may be possible to maintain muscle because we only need about 1/3 of the training volume to be able to maintain muscle mass. So it is probably quite possible to maintain a lot of the muscle mass through doing a kind of reduced training kind of volume, which means fewer sets per muscle group. But there are also physiological changes to your body during the first trimester. And one of them is that your connective tissue, so if you think about the ligaments and tendons that attach the muscles to the bones, they become more elastic. And so if they are more elastic, the muscles have to work harder to produce the same amount of force. So your muscles actually have to work harder than they would have to work outside of pregnancy. So this makes it practically just very difficult to lift the sorts of weights that you were lifting before pregnancy, even if you're very experienced. Again, this experience is going to change from women to women, and there are clearly women online, I see them lifting very, very heavy weights during their pregnancy, and they seem fine. And if that's you, that's great. But they are probably unicorns and you're probably not a unicorn. So if you do find that lifting the same amount of weight as you were lifting before pregnancy really hard when you do get pregnant, it's not because there's anything really wrong with you. It's just that you're not a unicorn, right? Some of these women are just really, really, smashing it, and it's great for them. I'm a bit jealous of them, but I'm not like these women. And if you're not, you shouldn't feel bad about that. You just got to do the best with what you can do. Then later on in your pregnancy, there are anatomical changes. So as your belly starts to get bigger, this starts to make it really hard to load the muscles the way that you were loading them before. So if you take something like a squat, when you have a huge belly, it just practically gets harder to lift the same amount of weight. And I find that, especially in my last trimester, that weight really decreases. Until this pregnancy, what I've managed to do is I've lost a lot of strength in my first trimester, then built it up again in my second trimester, and then kind of lost it a bit in my third trimester. And that's me kind of pushing myself as hard as I can, not really being afraid of lifting weights, knowing that it's safe and that it's beneficial, but still just practically not being able to do it. Then there's also hip pain. If you struggle with any sort of hip or pelvic pain, that can obviously just get in the way of these sorts of things as well. And the belly can also get in the way of some movements in a much more practical sense. It just gets in the way. So if you were doing 20 push-ups or even 3 push-ups before pregnancy, it becomes very hard to do push-ups when you are 8 or 9 months pregnant because the belly just gets in the way, right? The floor's in the way of that. So you're just not going to be able to do the movement through the full range of motion. And you're going to have to modify that, whether that's doing a bench press or putting the push-ups on an incline. And then there's also changes to our cardiovascular system, which I'll go into in a different podcast, but basically blood pressure goes down, heart rate goes up, and this makes our perceived effort when working out much, much, much higher. So if before you were doing a certain amount of weight, certain amount of reps, certain amount of sets, that same amount of work feels much, much harder for your cardiovascular system right from the first trimester. And that makes it practically just very hard to push as hard as you were doing before pregnancy. I know that this list can feel a little bit depressing and like it can sound a little bit defeatist coming from me. I'm trying to hit the middle ground between being realistic and being ambitious, because I absolutely do think that it's a good idea to train as hard as you can during pregnancy. But there are very real and very serious just symptoms that get in the way and make it practically very, very hard to do. And this is very, very hard for women who, in particular, women who are very strong and very fit and very athletic before pregnancy, is accepting those body changes and accepting the difficulty of training now can be very, very hard mentally, much more so than it is physically. And I think a lot of women fail to plan realistically for it and just think, oh, I'm just going to keep doing what I was doing before. And then when they're hit with the reality of it and they're seeing other women who are unicorns and who are able to lift really heavy weights during pregnancy, they feel really, really down on themselves. And this is certainly how I felt in my first pregnancy. But as time has gone on, I've had more pregnancies. I've realized, I just suck during pregnancy. There are women who suck a lot less than me during pregnancy, and I'm really glad for them. But I've got to just hang on for dear life, in a sense, and just kind of get through it. If you're somebody who has, HG and you're just throwing up all the time and just feeling really unwell. I mean, I feel terrible especially around weeks 8, 9, 10, 11. I feel really, really at the height of awfulness. But some women feel even worse than me. And if that's the case, you have to give yourself a little bit of grace as well. And there is this middle ground between pushing yourself and having high expectations, but also being kind to yourself as well. So the first kind of mechanism of hypertrophy and muscle growth is just simply loading the muscles sufficiently for it to occur. And for all the reasons I mentioned, that can get really, really hard. The second mechanism of muscle growth is progressive overload. So even if you're lifting a heavy weight, if you're just lifting the same weight, the same reps, the same sets for a year, you're not going to actually build muscle. And anyone who's serious about lifting weights knows this. You do actually have to progress over time. You actually have to move onto heavier weights and either more intensity or more volume over time. Volume being weight times reps times sets. So you could stay, if you're doing 60 kilo squats for 5 reps for 3 sets, you could stay at that, but then you could also add, 3 sets of lunges every week, and then you're increasing the volume without actually increasing the load. So progressive overload, very, very important in the initial stages, which, you're past that now if you're listening to this podcast episode, to be actually going up in weights. That's a big mistake that a lot of women make about, working out for muscle growth. Or you need to be increasing the training volume, or both of them. So for all the reasons that I mentioned before, that becomes practically very, very difficult to do during pregnancy. And Ironically, this is where it's easier for beginners, because if you are just starting out, you're going to benefit from beginners gains. Whereas if you have been training for a long time, you've been pushing really hard in the gym, you've been increasing your the weight that you're lifting in the major lifts, you've gone up in weight in your squat, you've gone up in weight in your deadlift, you're pressing more weight overhead, you're doing more push-ups you were doing before, you're doing more pull-ups doing before, then you get pregnant. In theory, to continue building muscle, you need to continue going up in weights, going up in training volume. But for all the reasons that I mentioned before, that's in practice very, very, very hard to do when you're hit with all the pregnancy symptoms. Again, if you're not hit with pregnancy symptoms, if you feel fine, you might be able to really push. But most women find that pregnancy symptoms are actually really quite debilitating, and they're just not able to do it. And then the third factor when it comes to muscle building is recovery and nutrition. If you're serious about your training, you'll know that you can only train as hard as you can recover. Pregnancy presents all kinds of problems and challenges to training with optimal intensity, but it also presents a load of problems for your recovery. Struggles with sleep and insomnia. This is so common in pregnancy. It can be because you're uncomfortable in later trimesters. Early on, it can just be because of hormonal changes. Then there's nausea and aversions to certain foods. This can be really surprising how debilitating this is and how difficult it is to prioritize protein and nutrient-dense foods. I've experienced horrendous nausea in my pregnancies, and protein, I'm normally a bit of a meathead. I love meat, I love fish, I love chicken, but it makes me feel so queasy. All I could really manage in my first trimester was some eggs and some protein powder in that made up the bulk of my nutrition in my first trimester. It is obviously possible to get adequate protein with that, but it's not as varied or as high quality as it could be. You also need to ensure that you're getting sufficient calories. Caloric needs don't actually change in the first trimester, but they go up by about 300 calories a day in the second trimester and about 450 in your third. So you need to be eating sufficient calories for both building a baby and for your training. So that's important as well. It's also important not to be eating too many calories. We'll talk about that in a separate podcast as well. But you do need to be eating sufficient calories, which for those of you who have really debilitating nausea or HG, you're going to find that that can be really hard to get things down. Some women lose weight, especially in their first trimester, and that's obviously not going to create the conditions we need for adequate recovery and nutrition. Protein needs, again, I'm going to cover this in a separate podcast, but basically they're very, very similar to outside of pregnancy. It's worth aiming for, if you're serious about training, it's worth aiming for 1.6 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight, or you might just take your actual body weight just to be on the safe side. It might be on the higher side. Since your body weight will increase during pregnancy, protein needs increase naturally. You don't have to sort of increase the equation, just increase it with the body weight. So if you start your pregnancy at 65 kilos, let's say you're aiming for 104 grams of protein a day, let's say your weight increases by 15 kilograms, then you'll be aiming closer to 128 grams a day. Again, this might sound very achievable if you're used to prioritizing protein in your diet. But again, let's not forget that your body's doing a lot of metabolic work. Your needs for all kinds of fats, minerals, proteins go up at the same time, that you might be experiencing nausea and food aversions, and then struggling to get sufficient nutrients for pregnancy and training. It is possible to do what I did and just focus. I think in my previous pregnancies, I just, had a carb fest. First trimester, I just ate, dry crackers and bread. Whereas in my fourth pregnancy, I was like, you know what? I can eat yogurt. I can manage, vanilla flavored protein powder in a banana shake or something. I can eat scrambled eggs with butter and toast. There are things that I can eat. So I prioritize those, even if it meant eating the exact same thing every day or having yogurt or protein powder a couple of times a day. It was better than, not having those things, even though it's not ideal. It'd obviously be way better to be eating red meat and chicken and fish, but it just wasn't possible for me to eat that. So it's about doing what you can do rather than just going, fuck it, because it can't be perfect. So I'm just not going to do anything. I'm just going to eat carbs and chocolate all day. Experiences of pregnancy symptoms vary so massively from one person to the next. And some women don't have any nausea at all. I have friends who don't have any nausea at all or who feel absolutely fine. And if that's you, that's great. And you should capitalize on that. And you should eat a really balanced diet and prioritize protein and get really hard workouts in. But it's also important to recognize that that makes you a unicorn. And most of you listening, you're not going to be unicorns. I've worked with pregnant and postpartum women for 10 years. I'm on my 4th pregnancy myself. The brutal truth is that most of us are not unicorns. If 1% of us are unicorns, that means that 99% of us are not unicorns, and we have to deal with actual reality. Okay, so now we've talked about the conditions necessary for muscle growth and how pregnancy fucks with that in lots of different ways. Let's switch our attention a little bit to something that might actually be more realistic for most of us non-unicorns, and that is maintaining muscle mass. Again, if you're starting your pregnancy very, very strong, it may just be very difficult for you to continue applying progressive overload to your training. And so what your focus should become is, how do I hold on to as much muscle mass as I possibly can? And as I mentioned before, you need about 1/3 of the training volume in order to maintain muscle. So if you're normally doing 9 sets of per muscle group per week, doing just 3 sets at the same weight, if you cut the sets by 1/3, that should be sufficient to maintain the muscle mass that you have been building. That usually surprises people. It's way less than they think. So it's actually much easier to maintain muscle mass than you think it is. And I haven't always lived up to this. Again, 3 pregnancies. First pregnancy, I was a bit paranoid about my pelvic floor, and so I just stopped lifting weights altogether. I don't think I lifted more than 5 kilograms throughout my entire pregnancy. I lost a lot of muscle mass, and I haven't really ever returned to those pre-baby muscle mass lessons, basically because I keep getting pregnant. Then in my 3rd pregnancy, I lifted about 5 kilos throughout my first trimester. Obviously would have lost muscle mass in those 3 months. But then I started to increase the weight that I was lifting and my overall training volume throughout the 2nd trimester, and then mostly maintained it throughout my 3rd trimester. So I think I managed to recover it. You've got to remember that 9 months is a really long time. And if you stop training altogether, you will lose a lot of muscle mass, right? Especially if you are already very muscular. So it's really just about doing as much as you can, being realistic, because you also don't want to poop yourself out. If you're training really hard, but then you're flat out for the rest of the day and you can't look after your existing kids and you can't work and you can't do anything else, you need to go and have a nap. That's obviously going to interfere with your life as well. So you have to train as hard as you can recover from and that you feel okay with. And just try to hold on to as much muscle mass as you can. This can feel very demotivating. Shifting your goals from building muscle to just maintaining muscle is just not very motivating for those of us who are just really into lifting heavier weights and getting stronger. I understand that. I've struggled with those same mindset aspects of it myself. And so with that, we're going to move into kind of the more mindset side of this podcast episode and talk about how you should think about it in order to be okay with just maintaining muscle mass or doing what you can. Okay, so the first mantra that you should adopt for your pregnancy training is modify before you omit. So before you get rid of something, see if you can change it, if you can modify it, and if you can adapt it. So this means that if you can't squat what you were squatting before, reduce the weight rather than just stopping squatting. This works whether you were squatting 100 kilograms or 20 kilograms before your pregnancy. Just reduce the weight to what you can do, pain and symptom free. Okay, and that's an important sentence, because if you can push the weights but your knee hurts, or you have really bad pelvic pain when you're squatting, or you're leaking, this is not, safe pregnancy lifting. For some of you, if you do have pelvic pain, that might mean reducing range of motion. So instead of doing full range of motion squats, you might need to do half range of motion squats or box squats. That's what I'm doing at the moment. I have a bit of a knee issue, and so I'm just squatting slightly less deep than I would normally squat when everything's fine. You want to try to modify the same movement and keep the movement as close to what you are already doing. So if you're like the example I gave with squats, you reduce the weight, you reduce the range of motion, but you keep doing squats. But if you do find that you can't squat because of hip or knee or pelvic pain, you can replace it with a compound lower body exercise that you can do, like RDLs or hip thrusts. These are obviously hinge exercises. They're hip dominant leg, so they're going to have a different focus to the knee dominant exercises like the squat. But for some of us, we just won't be able to do squats all the way through our pregnancy. But something like RDLs, Romania deadlifts, or hip thrusts will be easier on our joints, on our pelvis, on things like that. And the same applies for other exercises. So if you find you can't do pull-ups anymore, switch to an exercise that uses the same movement pattern. Like lat pull downs are fantastic if you're in a gym, or single arm pull downs. The same is true for every exercise. If you can't do a barbell shoulder press, switch to dumbbells, lower the weight on a bench press. If you can't do push-ups on the floor anymore because your belly's getting in the way, or because you're feeling too weak, move to incline push-ups. You can modify everything around the bump and around hip, knee, pelvic pain. There really are modifications for everything. You just have to try to stick to the same movement pattern as much as possible with different equipment or with different loading. I am going to do another podcast episode on modifications for pregnancy, and there are lots of videos on my YouTube channel that I've already done. And I'll also link below. I have a free 4-day course on how to train during pregnancy, where I take you through a lot of these modifications and show you exactly what training looks like with a bump. So you can join that below if you want a little bit more guidance with this. And I also have an online group program called Strong Pregnancy, where there are both follow along videos and there are written programs for those of you who are more serious about lifting in a gym or with dumbbells at home. And every month has modifications for that month and for the growing belly, and potentially for hip and pelvic pain mainly, or lower back pain or pelvic floor issues and things like that. So definitely check out Strong Pregnancy if you feel like you need more guidance around that. And I do also offer one-on-one coaching on my one-on-one online program to pregnant women, and that covers both the weight management side of things and the nutrition side of things and the training side of things. Anyway, back to how to lift during pregnancy. The second concept I want to introduce is the diminuendo. This is how I like to think of pregnancy training. So this is a term from music. Many of you will know it. And it's where the intensity goes down, or where the volume goes down in music gradually over time. So therefore, as we progress during pregnancy, and as a result of all the unpleasant and inconvenient physiological and anatomical changes, and sometimes psychological changes that are happening during pregnancy, most women who lift heavy weights simply find they can't lift as heavy and as they were doing before pregnancy, and they should therefore think of this as a diminuendo as pregnancy progresses. So you might start with a 60 kilo squat. I keep using squat as the example, but you can take any exercise, and then you reduce to 40 kilos in your first trimester, like 20 kilos in your third trimester, second trimester, 10 kilos or body weight squats in your third trimester. That's obviously a pretty steep diminuendo. Many of you might be able to, it might look more like 50 kilos, then 40 kilos, then 30 kilos. For me, it wasn't as straightforward. Again, I just dropped to like 5 kilos in my first trimester, then gradually built the weight back up. By the end of my second trimester, I was doing like 40 kilo squats. And then I think by the end of my third trimester, I was doing about 30 kilo squats. So it was a little bit up and down, but I just did what I could with the energy that I had at each stage of pregnancy. Incidentally, postpartum, you should think of your training as a crescendo. So the opposite of a diminuendo, where you start early and you start very gently, and then gradually week by week, you increase the training intensity and the training load and build back up to where you were before over a number of weeks and months, rather than doing nothing for 6 weeks and then boom, goes straight into what you were doing before. Again, we'll talk about all of that on a separate postpartum podcast episode. If you do find that your training follows a kind of diminuendo pattern over your pregnancy, some muscle loss is going to be inevitable. The idea is to maintain as much muscle mass as possible. If you can keep your training volume relatively high, you might hold on to all of your muscle mass during pregnancy. But if you do find that your training volume decreases towards the end of your pregnancy, again, if you're not a unicorn, if you're part of the 99%, there is going to be some muscle loss. But again, the difference between you losing 3 kilos of muscle and losing 10 kilos of muscle, I'm just completely pulling numbers out of my arse here, but the difference could be massive, right? You could maintain 70% of your muscle mass versus losing virtually all of it. And so doing what you can, right? Trying to train as hard as you can and as heavy as you can, deal with is really good, because you're not gonna, every kilo of muscle that you hold on to during pregnancy, you're not going to have to build back afterwards. The third concept I want you to adopt is an all or something mindset. Most women have an all or nothing mindset when it comes to dieting, when it comes to training. And what happens to a lot of fit, strong women whose identity is very wrapped up in their fitness level, like yours truly, it takes one to know one, right? I very much pride myself on my fitness, my strength level. So I'm not saying that as a criticism at all. But what they find is that when if they're no longer able to lift heavy weights or do the intense CrossFit that they were doing before, they just go, oh, well, I might as well not do anything. And that mindset holds them back far more than the actual physical symptoms of pregnancy. So I want to tell you a story, because this might sound silly, but you'll be surprised. Again, I've done this for 10 years. I've worked with pregnant women for 10 years, and I've seen how much this affects women. They find it so hard. They go, what's the point if I'm not doing X? So let me tell you a story of when I did my initial training to become a prenatal specialist 10 years ago. Absolutely shit course that I did in Tel Aviv, by the way. And 2 years before I went through pregnancy myself, there was another woman there. She was about halfway through her first pregnancy, and she was the only other woman there that lifted weights other than me. Everyone else just did Pilates and Zumba and sat around on a fitness ball and called that exercise. She said to me, I had to stop lifting when I was pregnant. I just couldn't do it anymore. I was squatting 70 kilos before pregnancy, and I just couldn't lift that sort of weight anymore. So I just had to stop. So I asked her very naively if she had tried lifting less weight. Have you tried lifting 60 kilos or 40 kilos or an empty barbell, which was 20 kilos? Or have you just done a body weight squat? And she looked at me just with a confused look on her face and said, why would I lift less weight? It doesn't do anything. And this is exactly the mindset that plagues so many women, is they go, if I can't lift 70 kilos, there's no point doing anything. But even if you have to drop to body weight squats, you're just squatting your body weight because you're so fatigued in your first trimester. This is what I did with my first pregnancy. I was so overwhelmed and so fatigued. But I just showed up and I did my air squats. I was working out in a CrossFit gym at that time, and I just did my sets of air squats. And the coach said to me, you can do a barbell, you can add some weight. And I was just like, fuck off, I can't. This is all I can do. You might think, okay, it doesn't do anything. What's the point? But this woman, she chose to lift literally nothing and do 0 squats with 0 weight for 9 months. And presumably postpartum, instead of doing what she could do, even if that's way lighter, because she would have maintained way more muscle mass and way more strength that way than just doing nothing. And the reason why I say I assume postpartum too is that she's not just going to wake up one morning and be like, oh, I can lift 70 kilos today, 6 weeks postpartum, 6 months postpartum, whatever. She's going to have to start from nothing and gradually build her way back up to 70 kilos. That's the only way she's going to get there. Remember that crescendo. Unless she has the all or something mindset, okay, I just have to start with the first step, then she's just not going to be able to get back into training. And this is where you get women who have had 3 kids and they say, oh, I was so fit before pregnancy. Because if they're not able to do what they were doing before, there's no point doing anything. And that is so not true. I cannot tell you how, my oldest is 7.5 now, and how my training has gone through dips. Throughout the years, I've had times when I'm training more often, when I'm training heavier, where I've had injuries, where I've been recovering postpartum, where I've been really sick and pregnant. And my training has taken a real dip and been really shit, but I've carried on doing something. And then I've been able to build it back up afterwards. Being able to go with those ebbs and flows rather than beating ourselves up and just doing nothing instead of something, that is absolutely essential. One last thing I want to mention, I've got all the way to the end of this podcast episode without mentioning pelvic floor, really. And that obviously is a very important factor, especially if you're planning a vaginal birth. I don't want to go into too much detail in this podcast episode, and I will talk about heavy lifting or lifting weights and your pelvic floor in a separate podcast episode. But let's just massively oversimplify, for many women, lifting very, very, very heavy loads when heavily pregnant may be too much for their pelvic floor. It may cause leaking. It does massively increase intra-abdominal pressure. Some women will not be able to manage that intra-abdominal pressure, and it might come out with all sorts of, leaking or incontinence or even prolapse. But for other women, it may be completely fine. I know that for me, my first pregnancy, before I ended up with an emergency C-section or whatever, I was very paranoid about my pelvic floor. And that was something that psychologically, it didn't allow me to lift heavier weights. Although even if it's just completely, I probably could have lifted much heavier weights than I actually did. Lifting very heavy loads can cause a hypertensive pelvic floor, which isn't great if you want to give birth through that pelvic floor. The long story short is that for most of us, lifting moderately heavy loads for a higher rep range is probably going to be better for us and better for our pelvic floor overall than lifting very maximally heavy loads. And I'm talking about doing 1 rep maxes like the day before giving birth and things like that. Again, for many women, it may be completely fine, but if you're just, not sure, then moderate loads might be better for most women in pregnancy. One other important factor that I haven't touched on yet is just your own fears around lifting weights. So lifting weights is very safe. The guidelines now are that pregnant women should lift weights twice a week throughout their pregnancy, that it's safe and beneficial, and that the benefits outweigh the risks, and the lifting heavy weights and exercise in general does not increase or decrease your chances of miscarriage. Okay, this is important to know, but having said that, even if you know that and you take that on board, if you feel nervous about lifting heavy weights because you're afraid that it will cause a miscarriage or cause some other problem, then you have to factor that in. I would never encourage a woman who feels very scared and nervous about lifting weights to lift heavy weights during her pregnancy, because the mental side of things, if that is worrying you, and if heaven forbid anything does happen and you feel like it was because of that, I just don't think that mental worry is worth it. And yes, it's worth educating women that it's not actually dangerous, that it is beneficial for you. But, if you are somebody who has a very anxious mother or an anxious sister or an anxious friend who's in your ear, or anxious husband who's in your ear saying, this could happen, are you sure? Is it safe? Maybe it's dangerous. It can affect you. And some of us know people who have had pregnancy losses. I've heard women say things like, oh, my friend lifted heavy weights throughout her pregnancy and then she had a miscarriage very late on in the pregnancy. Now, the miscarriage probably wasn't caused by the lifting heavy weights. We have no evidence that lifting heavy weights or exercise of any kind causes a miscarriage, and plenty of women who don't exercise at all or lift heavy weights at all have miscarriages. Again, lifting heavy weights, exercising, it doesn't increase or decrease your risk of miscarriage. But still, those stories can loom very heavy in your mind if you are close to somebody who has had a miscarriage, or indeed if you've struggled with infertility, if you've struggled with IVF, or if you've had lots of miscarriages in the past. This does affect some women, and they become overly cautious about everything. Like they don't do anything that could risk. Like they really close themselves off to everything, and that includes lifting weights or exercise. And while I would love to see those women exercise because of the mental benefits that it would have for them more than anything else, again, I do respect when somebody has that like real fear around it. And I wouldn't sort of encourage you to push through that and ignore that if that's how you're feeling, because your mental state does really matter. And if that really affects you and something that really worries you and causes a lot of anxiety for you, it may just be better for you to just not exercise or not lift weights during your pregnancy and come back to it postpartum. I say that with a really heavy heart because I really believe in the benefits of exercise during pregnancy, but we have to be able to meet people where they're at as well. And it's maybe better for some women to say, okay, well, I'm just going to put it to one side for now, just because it's going to be easier for me mentally, rather than, push herself to do it and then, be constantly anxious about it. So, okay, we've covered a lot in this episode, but basically, in theory, it is possible to continue building muscle during pregnancy if you continue to follow the rules of progressive overload and get sufficient recovery and sufficient nutrition. But as I've talked about extensively in this podcast episode, lots and lots of things get in the way of that during pregnancy: physical, mental, psychological, and physiological and anatomical. We're kind of hit from all angles. A final word about mindset is that it can be incredibly difficult for very fit women and very strong women to accept the changes and limitations to their routine. The prospect of losing hard-earned gains can be really scary. The prospect of losing muscle mass, of losing strength. I've been there myself, as somebody who can smash out 10 pull-ups to then not being able to do a single pull-up. It's really hard, not to mention, gaining body fat, and just like not looking as lean or as muscular as I used to look. These things are all things I'm going to talk about in other podcast episodes, but they're very hard to deal with mentally. And it's more than just about lifting heavy weights and muscle mass. It can be a really scary change or loss of identity. It's really important to embrace the physical changes and adapt to them. This might involve some grief and letting go for many of you. It did for me. But you have to remember that pregnancy is temporary. Postpartum is forever. And motherhood is forever. If you train right, you can maintain a lot of muscle mass, or all of your muscle mass even. It is possible. And you can return to previous levels of strength and fitness, especially if you have the right mindset around it and that you can go with the flow. This is often not very easy for women who are really into exercise. We're normally not very go with the flow kind of individuals. We like to control things. But pregnancy and motherhood and birth and postpartum, it does involve letting go of a lot of control. This was one of the hardest lessons for me to learn. But you do regain that control, and you can regain it postpartum. And remember that proper and safe pregnancy exercise is more beneficial to you. That the benefits outweigh the risks for both you and baby, and it's your postpartum prehab. So it is possible to gain muscle mass during pregnancy, but in practice it's very hard to do with fatigue, nausea, food aversions, musculoskeletal pain, growing belly, it makes it very difficult to meet the criteria for muscle growth, which is mechanical tension, progressive overload, and adequate nutrition and recovery. Therefore, a sensible goal for most fit and strong women is to maintain as much muscle mass and strength as possible. Our mindset can often present more of a problem than the physical realities of pregnancy. So it's really important to address your mindset, to adopt an all or something mindset, and changes to body image and identity make this a very challenging landscape to navigate. We should adopt that something is better than nothing mindset, modify before we emit, and not catastrophize if our pregnancy training looks like a gradual diminuendo or looks different to how we expected it to be. One of the best ways of combating this and a loss of control as well is to follow a structured training program specifically for experienced women experienced with lifting weight, and specific for pregnancy with modifications for each month or each trimester of pregnancy and for the anatomical and physiological changes of pregnancy. Just because you were lifting weights before pregnancy, you don't have to, just because you're pregnant, you don't have to switch to just like yoga or Pilates or something. You can still lift weights. And as I mentioned before, my Strong Pregnancy program does exactly that, right? It offers you a structured strength training program for just twice a week that gives you actual adaptations and modifications for each stage of pregnancy, so that it's appropriate for, all of those physiological and anatomical changes. And again, there is the online coaching. I'm only taking people on for the next couple of months because I'm going to stop working myself before I come back postpartum, probably next September. But in any case, whenever you're listening to this, reach out to me about one-on-one coaching. I'll put the links for both Strong Pregnancy and my coaching below so that you can explore them or reach out to me if you have more questions. So thanks for listening to this podcast episode. I hope it answered your questions around pregnancy training and whether or not it's realistic to gain or maintain muscle mass during pregnancy. If you have any questions whatsoever or any requests for this pregnancy series of my podcast, please put them in the comments below. I'd be really interested to hear them and more than happy to answer your questions. So thanks for listening.